Oh, you do that one. The whole function.
Thank you. All right. Hi, guys. Thank you for being here very late at night. I appreciate your stamina for Technica, so thank you. But we're just going to be going through user interviews today, or more importantly, understanding what your user needs before you go ahead and build a product that nobody wants, which is not good. But oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, so does anyone want to take a guess why it's important to know your users ahead? Or I kind of actually gave that away. Well, it's important to know your users because, and this is something that happens in companies so often, and not just small companies, and multi-million-dollar companies. They do this and then they sink a bunch of time into making something that nobody wants. And that's the real pitfall. Doesn't matter if you're just starting out. If you're just starting out, it could cost you your entire business. If you're a larger company, it can cost you a lot of money and a lot of time. That's just absolutely wasted. Neither of which are very good outcomes. But it's important for a lot of other reasons as well. So, just a few statistics for you. The cost of fixing an error after development is done is 100 times greater than that of fixing it before it launches. Not just 5 times greater, not just 20 times greater, it's 100 times greater. It's also important to know that when you test or do research with about 5 users, just 5, you're able to identify 85% of issues when it comes to usability. And that's a lot. That's almost all of it. Developers spend about 50% more of their time on avoidable rework after the fact that they could be spending building something new. And then 53% of consumers feel like brands fail to meet their expectation standards. That's over 50% by a few percentage points, but that's definitely the majority, and it's definitely more than half. So, and these are things that are just common. It's not like they are not frequently happening or that they're a rare case. They happen very often, like I said, with lots of big companies, and it's just a waste of resources and time. And the main reason why it's such a big problem is because your end users are the ones who will be directly having to deal with the consequences of your design and development choices. It's not going to be you. It's not going to be your boss. It's not going to be whoever on your team is pushing this product forward. You are not designing products for yourself, usually, or building projects for yourself, usually. And things that might be crystal clear to you, not guarantee that they're going to be crystal clear to anyone else who is going to be in the target user base. If you ignore all of these other people, the people you're making something for, or remove them from the design process completely, then you risk designing something that nobody needs, nobody wants, or nobody can use. And then you have just a product that doesn't really serve a purpose. Users are the ones that have the final decision over whether they use your product or not. They determine your success. And that is why it's very important for you to do user research. Oh, we have some more people here. That's okay. All right, welcome. So, getting back into it, why should you, or when should you do user research? We've established why it's important. There are all these really impactful statistics about it, but when should you do it? Well, it depends on the type of research you're trying to do. So if you're doing generative user research, this is what happens before you know what you're even designing for. That happens at the way beginning, when you're just trying to understand the problem that you want to solve. This research is done to refine your problem and understand the context of that problem. It happens at the beginning before you do anything else. Then you have descriptive or explanatory research, which is observing and describing details around your problem statement. That happens after you do generative research, but before you start building something or even thinking about what that solution might be. You're still just trying to understand what the issue is so you can best design something to fix that. Then you have user research, and that happens after you've understood fully the context of the problem, and now you need to understand the players. Players are important because they're who you are building for. That happens after all of the problem has been established, after you know what you're doing, but that happens before you start making a solution. You do not want to jump headfirst into making a solution when you know a problem, because then you're completely ignoring all of the intricacies of who you're designing it for. And that can, again, lead to rework. One more. Lots of people joining online. Okay, I feel happy now. Okay, so, and then there's user testing. And user testing happens after you've done the first round of coming up with a solution. And that's to verify, did I do this right? Do people are going to like this? Is this the right feature to move forward with? So depending on what type of research you're doing, it happens at different stages in the design process, but it should be an integral part of every single feature you build. It's not just one thing you do for the overarching whole. It should be part of individual features, because sometimes if you just look at the whole, you miss the details, and then you end up again designing features that nobody wants, and that's a loss of time. But we're here to specifically talk about user research, which happens after you know the problem, but before you come up with a solution. It is different than user testing because it revolves around understanding why your users or how your users behave and why they behave that way. You're trying to understand them as people. It helps you understand their needs and priorities. It helps you understand the product usage context. You know, where is this going to fit in their daily lives? How is it going to fit in their daily lives? It replaces your assumptions with actual insights. There are tons of problems that you can think about solving right now. I don't know if you're probably solving one right now as part of Technica, but you probably just jumped right in from problem all the way into solution. Who is going to use that? You maybe, but it may not solve the rest of the problem, because you're making a lot of assumptions about the people you're designing it for. And assumptions are not testable, and they may not be correct because they're just guesses. Now, you can inform your guesses by doing user research and replacing that with actual insight. You can create and utilize design targets to represent user needs throughout the design and decision-making process. That way you stay committed and understanding and knowledgeable of how what you're doing is going to end up fitting with and being utilized by the people you are creating the product for. And finally, it allows you to develop meaningful and appropriate interfaces by understanding how real people interact with the world. You know, it's funny, you know, sometimes you design things thinking that they're actually going to work, but when you actually test them out in the real world, nobody knows how to use them because it's drastically different. You don't want to reinvent the wheel because the wheel already works. And again, that's why you do user research, because if something's already working, then maybe that's not what you want to do. That's not what you want to solve. This involves interacting with real people. It's more than just doing statistical research online, doing literature reviews online. That can get you somewhere, but it won't get you to the point of knowing your users as people. And this is what this does. And it is interdisciplinary. So much when it comes to working in tech or working when it comes to products, it involves interdisciplinary thought, especially if you're working at a company that is young, that is small, that is a startup. You know, you haven't had time to differentiate your roles, and likely you're going to have to cover more than one role. So you're going to need to know how to do things, especially when they're as important as this. Okay. So it is important to know, however, before you hop into your research, that user research is not about what users like and dislike. Why? Because that changes every single day. When I was 9, I hated pears. Now I love pears. That changes. So does other habits, other thoughts, other feelings. You might like the color blue last year. Maybe this year your favorite color is yellow. You know, you do not want to ask and focus on what people like, because that is subject to change. And if you base a product on that, it might risk becoming irrelevant 10 years, 5 years, a year down the line, because it's based on something that's transient. Users are not designers. They're not developers. They cannot tell you what they like or they dislike, and they cannot imagine and they cannot answer accurately about things they do not know. You know, If you walk up to a random person who has never touched any sort of computer science language at all and say, hey, we're trying to make this feature for you. How would you design it? How would you build it? They will look at you and be like, I don't know, boxes, squares, buttons. That doesn't get you anywhere. So you don't want to ask them about those things. Answers can also differ depending on the situation, right? If somebody is talking to the head of a company, a CEO, they might really play up the fact that they love that company. They might hate that company, you know? A lot of people have questionable relationships with Apple Macs because of certain reasons. I'm one of them. When I talk to people who work at Apple, I do not tell them that. But when I talk to people who work at Microsoft, I do tell them that, you know? And the same thing happens in interviews. If people feel like there is a specific answer that is expected of them, they're going to give that answer, and that's going to be misleading to you. So all of these things are things you have to keep in mind when you're developing questions and when you're asking those questions. So, user interviews. This is one method of doing user research. There are plenty of other methods out there. This is one that's most frequently used because it's the most straightforward. It gets you what you need, arguably faster, and it has less bias than, say, focus groups or doing things like guerrilla research. So we're going to be focusing on this. So, but there are other ways. So if you want to do a different way, you can also do a different way. User interviews determine influences on products interaction. You need to keep in mind that the questions you ask will be different than the ones you want answered. You know, if you go up to someone and say, hey, do you need the solution? They might say yes. That doesn't mean they're going to use your solution, because again, that's based on a want. It's based on a like. It's not based on something that's concrete. It's not based on evidence. You also want to make sure that you remain as unleading as possible and listen to what is said. Instead of saying, what do you like about what I've done? That frames it in a way that makes whoever you're asking the questions to only focus on the things that they like. Not going to help you about anything. How do you feel when you use what I have done? That is not leading. Feelings can be any sort of type of feelings. It could be negative, it could be positive, but also it's based on past experiences. Not how does this make you feel? How has this made you feel when you were actually using it? That is based on evidence, and that is something that you can trust. So when you're doing interviews, there's a specific method that you can do that's likely going to lead to better success. You want to make sure you introduce the participant to you in the study before you get started. You want to make sure they understand its purpose, why it's relevant, why it's significant. Then you want to explain how the information will be shared. A lot of times when people are doing customer or user interviews, they'll just go in, skip all the pleasantries, ask questions because they don't have a lot of time or something like that. Especially when you're gathering research like this, if you do not take the time to do things properly and explain, you know, what the privacy policy is and how the research and information is going to be collected, you can get legally sued in the future if you become a big company. Not good. Don't want to do that. So explain how the information will be used and shared and how you're collecting it. Gather informed consent and consent to record if possible. Always make sure you do that before you ask any sort of formal interview questions. Make sure you do this. You also want to listen to what questions the participants have ahead of time. You want to warm up with demographic questions, conduct the main section of the interview, wind down with closing questions, and conclude with thanks and administrative topics like what happens after this? Do they get a gift card? Do we need their email? All of that other stuff. And you don't have to do this completely off the top of your head, or at least you shouldn't, because that's a lot to keep in your mind. You can develop something that's known as a user interview plan. And that is something you should bring with you either on a computer or print it out before you walk in and sit down to do a structured interview. An interview plan contains the goals and description of the study. This helps you keep on track with what you're actually trying to accomplish, but also helps the user to understand why you're doing this in the first place. The last thing you want is to want to get certain information and end up walking away with completely irrelevant information because you didn't keep your questions tailored. Not good. These are 3 to 4 broad statements that you want to accomplish through this study. You're not ever going to try to accomplish everything in a single interview, not enough time. So you want to make sure you really hone in on what you want to walk away with for what you're doing right now. It also should include basic demographic questions, so who are these people? Where do they come from? What is their background? What is their persona archetype? All of that other stuff. It puts their answers into context so you don't have to hunt down for that stuff later. You also want to make sure that any information you can find about your participant on the web, you do not ask them because it's a waste of time. You put that in the demographics section. All right, then there's warm-up questions. It primes the participant into the mindset of an interview. You wouldn't ask somebody about the theory of life when you just meet them. That is way too big of a topic. They're just going to be thrown completely off guard and say, what? I need to think about this. I wasn't unprepared. You start with something simple, something that's very easy for them to answer. So for example, if you are asking about a specific social media, maybe you're designing a new social media app and you want to understand how many people will use it. Start with something, don't ask them, hey, we're developing the social media app and it's going to be this. What do you think about? That's too much. Start with, how often do you use social media? That's something concrete, something that they usually can pull right off the top of their head. Start with questions like that. The actual questions are going to be the focus of the interview. And you want to make sure they are based in past behavior, not on likes, not on future assumptions, not on future expectations. Don't ask how people think they will act. Ask them how they have acted in the past in similar situations with similar products. So for example, if you're trying to figure out if you add Reels to your new social media platform, don't ask them, would you like Reels in this platform? They might say yes. That might not be accurate. Ask them, how often do you currently use Reels when you use social media? That is a concrete statistic, and that is likely going to stay the same across the board. And then you want to end with closing questions, which are broad focus questions that wind down, but also give you next steps of research topics that you can follow up with in the future. What is something that we did not talk about that you feel like we should know? Or, we've talked about this app, we've asked questions about it. What do you think we should add to this? And this is where you can get a little bit more theoretical because this is not factual data. This is just leading you to a next step of getting the factual data and figuring out what you want to ask about. So the most complicated part of any sort of interview is the interview questions, because it can be somewhat tricky to draft. When it comes to writing your interview questions, you want to make sure you have a plan. Don't go into an interview with everything in your head and hoping things go for the best. They won't, but also that will lead to not standardized results. And those results, if they're not standardized, you can't really use them effectively. You want to come in with a plan, predetermined questions. You also want to be flexible. Have several follow-up questions ready and prepared that you can ask in case they give a specific answer. It's also good when you get to facilitating, and as you do facilitating more often, you'll be able to take advantage of opportunities to ask follow-up questions, maybe in the spur of the moment, but that does take time and it does take practice. You want to be conversational, you want to be elaborate, and you want to make sure you elaborate and explore useful segues, like I just mentioned. You want to prioritize open-ended questions, no yes, no's. That's not what this is for. That's what first surveys are for. This is about them expanding qualitative data. If you ask them, make sure to ask them to elaborate afterwards if you do use yes, no questions. You want to also avoid leading questions. Like I said, frame questions to avoid priming to a specific answer. Don't reveal too much about the answer you expect. If people hate testudo for some reason, for multiple different reasons. If you're asking a question about how people like testudo and you expect the answer to be, I hate it, don't say, how much do you hate testudo? That is a leading question. They will say, I hate it. That doesn't give you anything. Say, how does testudo or using testudo make you feel? And they'll be like, oh, well, I really just like this aspect, and this aspect makes me really frustrated, but I actually really like this aspect. I teach a class on UX design, and it's funny because I have a group doing a project to redesign testudo, and they actually fell into this pitfall, which is where I'm getting this example from. They're like, oh, everyone's going to hate testudo. This is just, and in their interview, they were just focusing so heavily on that they missed the fact that when they interviewed someone, they actually really didn't have that much of an issue with testudo because they only used it for specific purposes. They're like, oh my God, what do we do now? Our interview's entirely bogus. I was like, this is why you don't focus in on that stuff and ask leading questions. What they ended up doing was they realized one of the nice things that they learned was that Test Studio doesn't have a mobile app. And that's where they focused, was through the one question that actually had nothing to do with what they thought it was going to have to do with. So make sure you don't ask the leading questions. And then you want to make sure you break down the questions into answerable chunks. Simplify themes into concrete questions. All right, so just a few examples. You don't want to ask, what was the last thing you bought online? Very broad, very general. If they tell you what it is, that doesn't help you do anything if you're building like an online store on how you should design it. It just tells you what they like. Tell me about the last time you bought something online. Open-ended, talks about an experience, talks about pitfalls, encourages them to expand. That's how you should frame questions. Okay. And then interview tips. Writing the interview plan is the first part, and that usually takes a little bit of time if you want it to be done correctly. The second part is actually doing the interview. So you want to, when you're doing an interview, and this again takes time, it takes practice, you get better at it as you go along. But when you set up the interview, you want to make sure you create a comfortable, casual, and conversational environment. It should not feel like an interrogation. They will not give you the answers that you need. It should be talking to people, chatting, getting to know them. You want to listen more than you talk. You should only talk to ask relevant questions. You're not inputting your own opinions into their mouths. Let them talk, take notes, as many notes as you can. Be as accurate as possible in your note taking. You want to try to get as close to a transcript as you can, because all of that information could be helpful to you. You want to make sure you go to your participants' environments, because that's going to be more comfortable, and that's also going to elicit better results because it's less biased than if they come into your office. If Apple interviewed everyone at their office, they'd probably get very biased results, because people will be like, oh, I'm in the Apple office, I can't tell them how much I dislike Apple, you know. You want to briefly tell them the goal of the study, but make sure you don't influence their responses. You can use deceit in studies. That's an entire topic. You just need to make sure you do it ethically and you disclose it at the end. But for the purposes of this, tell them what they need to know, but don't tell them more than that. And don't tell them anything that might influence their responses. You want to encourage your participants to share their thoughts. Make sure they elaborate. Avoid leading or yes, no questions. Ask clarifying questions if you don't understand something. If you didn't catch what they said, repeat it back to them and ask them to verify if that's correct. Write out your questions in advance, but be flexible in the moment. Adapt to what they say. Ask follow-up questions based on their answers. Take pictures or record if possible. It is a pain to try to interview and take a transcript at the same time. I know I've done it before. It is very stressful. So if you can get an audio recording or a video recording and take notes later, that is ideal. And then you want to make sure you pay attention until they leave, because everything from the moment they walk in to the moment they leave tells you something about who they are as a user and who they are as a person. All right, so that is pretty much it. Does anyone have any questions? Nope. Anybody in the Zoom have any questions? Nope. All right. Well, I hope you guys all found this informative and helpful. Next time you are building something, think about doing at least 1 or 2 interviews ahead of time, because it may drastically change what you end up making. But yeah, thank you guys for being here.